All right, so we're going to start off pretty strong today. I know Olympics has been in the conversation for quite some time now, and now with surfing approaching Tokyo, things are getting excited. I think, was it last year? I believe when Fernando came and talked about all the work he's done along with the ISA as they approach the Tokyo Summer Games, and amazing efforts just to get it that far. So we're anticipating that the Olympics will be a game changer for sure, for surfing, and provide a boost in visibility for the sport, the culture, the athletes, the products, and so on. And obviously, we're trying to see how we can commodify that and obviously gain from it. And we're going to get into some of those details. But what can we do as a collective industry, and I should say individually as brands, to prepare for the Olympics? So we've assessed a pretty diverse panel, and I think you guys are going to get some great information, and hopefully we'll open up to Q&A. So feel free to keep those questions written down, and we can get to those right after. So let's bring them up. We've invited a group of experts on the topic to join us here today and share their thoughts on how we can use the next 2 years to get ready for what will most likely be the hugest increase and interest from consumers on the surfing front. Please welcome to the stage Leanne Buckingham, the Associate Director of Global Experiential Marketing at Saatchi & Saatchi, Mark Ervin, Senior Vice President of Clients for Olympic and Action Sports Athletes at IMG, Josh Kendrick, Senior Director of Athlete Marketing for Red Bull North America, and Alana Nichols, the winner of the heat this morning at Old Man's and 3-time Paralympic gold medalist. You remember from last night. Give him a round of applause. Let's get him up on stage. Good to see you again.
Hey, Pat. Hey, Josh.
And by the way, Josh, he got the memo. We're just trying to, the two loudest shirts in the room today. But Josh was staying out on the Cape on a family trip, and he's like, yeah, I could buzz down to see him. So thank you, Josh, for taking time out of the family vacation. Okay, so we've got a lot of things to cover, and we kind of had a quick powwow before we hopped up here, because I know a lot of you are asking, why should I care about the Olympics? How's it going to impact my company? How do I gain some leverage and get anything out of it? So before we do that, I think it's helpful seeing that, oh dear.
That just took off.
A rogue chair, yeah.
It has brakes, my bad. Sometimes when I jump in my car, I'm like, next thing you know,
yeah,
like,
she's been sending it all morning, so that's like, that's right on cue. I love it.
It's not broken, we're good. Chair's fine. Sorry.
So it's interesting, I know some of us here have been through this whole, I guess, rigmarole and the cycle of like resisting the Olympics and then finally embracing it, like with snowboarding. So there's a couple of details I think we'll go through, and we'll spoon feed some of it. You might know what Rule 40 is, but maybe if maybe both of you could break down what Rule 40 and why it matters, and how the surf companies, if they're cognizant of the fact, they can definitely benefit. So if you want to take them.
Nothing better than Rule 40.
Okay.
Get a party started.
Yeah.
So Rule 40 is the rule that states that during the blackout period of the Olympics, which is the 9 days prior the games and 3 days after, that no athlete is allowed to use their name, image, or likeness in any form of advertising. So for the longest time, that was a massive barrier for activation for brands who support these athletes the other 3.5 years of the cycle. And what's interesting, though, is going into Sochi, the IOC actually demonstrated that they were capable of evolving in a direction that favored athletes versus just straight up generated more money for their entity. And they created an exemption to Rule 40, which any brand can apply for an exemption, even if you have a conflicting sponsor who's an IOC sponsor or a USOC sponsor, or whether it's an NGB or an IF, whichever acronym you want. You as a brand can file for an exemption from that rule, so long as you can demonstrate that the use of the athlete isn't in an Olympic context, and that the ad campaign or the product that is in store will be in store before, during, and after the game. So in other words, it looks like an ad campaign that would exist whether the Olympics was there or not. And that affords brands a really great opportunity to activate in a meaningful way around the games.
So to dovetail into that, so for us, Red Bull, so we're not an Olympic sponsor by any means. And we utilize this exemption by sort of doing normal day-to-day business, right? So we applied with the right timelines, the right guidelines, and did that, and sort of had our athletes on our website, had social campaigns that were going on, and utilized as is. But no road to Rio or road to Tokyo or go for the gold. They're really stringent about the connection to the Olympics.
Yeah.
So I want to ask Leanne, in terms of, you've dealt with so many different types of events. How do the Olympics differ in terms of how it elevates the partnership with the athletes? Because I know there's a lot of companies here that are thinking about, okay, we have this roster, how can we potentially capitalize on it and do it in a way that's not too heavy-handed?
Yeah, I think, so, let me back up a second. I actually am working most recently with a brand that does actually sponsor the Olympics. So it's the different dynamic of sort of, they have the rights to do things, but prior to that happening, we had athletes that also competed in the games and we didn't have a relationship. And I think that understanding the cycle of when you're sponsoring events and you're at events and there's that momentum into the Olympics and right after, and really having plans around athletes who have that momentum that the Olympics has brought to them, I think is, you underestimate the power of the average person now recognizing an athlete because they were in the games. And so really anything that you do in the 6 to 8 months post-Olympics where an athlete's had this platform to gain new audience and fans, I think really having an on-site presence that acknowledges that and plans that really bring that athlete to connect to those new fans at an event that you may normally not expect to see some of those fans at, I think is really important. And kind of being prepared for that new fan that might be coming in that doesn't know your brand. They just heard a story about an Olympian that they fell in love with on the telecast, and now they're coming to seek that athlete out, and you have a chance to kind of bring them in as someone who wasn't a fan of your brand before, and now they're going to fall in love with this athlete, they fall in love with your brand. So I think it's really important to make sure that your activations at events, sort of before and after, really are inclusive of those that maybe don't know who you are and aren't fans of the sport before the Olympics.
And Alana, did you notice the fans that you were able to get through the Olympics maybe a little different, in terms of a broader base? Maybe you talk about how it opened your eyes in terms of reaching a whole new subset.
Yeah, I mean, the Olympics and the Paralympics, they're just this one event. It's a one-off thing, but it really does provide a platform for you to kind of create this momentum and build a community surrounding these athletes. I mean, it's the world stage, and I think one of the most exciting things about the Olympics is you get that one chance, you have that one day, you have that one competition. But really what's happening is when you get people on board with the athlete's story, you kind of tell their backstory. That's what people love about the Olympic and Paralympic Games. It's like, where is this person from? What kind of, ups and downs have they had in their lives? And why do I care? I want to feel connected. And so, leading up to the games is kind of really the important stuff, the content capture that happens there, the way that you tell their story. And then the Olympics happens, and that's kind of the magic that kind of seals the deal, I think.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, though, the time leading into the game. So this question would go for everyone here. Maybe talk about a little bit of the difference in terms of the planning. Like, we're used to, everyone in the surf industry is used to that cycle, the trade show cycle, and it's quarterly, and it goes to fall, to winter. But what's necessary on the pre-planning part? Mark, you want to?
Well, I think of it as an adult who learned to surf as an adult, which was pride swallowing siege of my life. But I was amazed at how, and really struggled with how early I had to paddle in order to catch a wave. And I think that analogy applies here. Like, it is time to start paddling. And because that wave looks like it's a long way away, but the reality of the games is that it necessitates a really long lead up, or else you won't be able to, like we talked about with Rule 40, you have to be very organized to file for that exemption. And if you're going to make the types of investment to have product in store, for a lot of the brands out here have athletes, and you're going to make decisions about regional athletes, and some of you have global athletes, You need to make decisions about how they're going to be integrated in your product offering and your advertising, and that needs to be figured out well in advance so that you can pick the right horses, build the right programs, and have the necessary lead up to then file for the exemptions and start the storytelling cycle as well, and make sure that your narrative is linked to the narrative of your activation piece, which I look at the world through an athlete lens because that's what I do. So that's how I tend to think of it, but you need to start to think about where your brand narrative aligns with that athlete's narrative and get out in front of it so that somebody else isn't inventing your story for you. NBC is going to tell a story, and people are lazy inherently, so if you help them to understand what their story is.
You set up Josh here perfectly, because before we came up on stage, Red Bull did a really amazing piece on Michaela Schifrin, definitely a skiing phenom to say the least, and you guys dumped a lot of effort, money, and that was, 2 years prior, at least, that went into that.
Yeah, so
NBC ended up picking it up.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on there. It's like the selection of the athlete themselves. Like, we understand, like, when we approach an athlete, it's a long-term partnership. We most likely, in alpine skiing, or surfing or skateboarding for that matter, of the Olympics will be this milestone that this athlete wants to do and achieve. So we want to support them for that specific, but for the whole sort of duration of their sort of quest, I guess, right? And so it goes with who that athlete is. We have a great relationship with NBC. I mean, that's helpful. We have a working relationship with them. So that's in sort of our normal day-to-day business. We can leverage that relationship for projects like this. We have a model of sorts, I guess. We've done that with Lindsey Vonn. We've done that with Shaun White back when he was turned in Vancouver. And sort of like helping support them, helping tell that story. And literally it's at least a 2-year minimum sort of like concept to reality. So yeah,
it's more of a long play, and this gets to managing expectations, right? I think everyone wants quantifiable results, but a little bit faster. I think you have to maybe adjust that for the Olympics.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I think this industry has going for it that a lot of other maybe industries don't, is that you guys have the relationship with the athletes already. That's not new. I mean, I think the surf industry is the richest in the culture of the heritage of the athletes. So I think that the good news is you're probably ahead of the game there. I think it's sort of figuring out what that activation is, to your point, but not even just the Olympics, but post-Olympics. Because I think that the athletes are going to suddenly have a lot more attention. They're going to have other sponsors that come in just for the 1 year, which is not always a bad thing. Those are good deals. Andrew next to me, I'll say that. But they also suddenly, an athlete that was maybe available to you way more than usually very quickly and nimbly, may now suddenly be mired in a bunch of other obligations, even just media obligations, things like that. So I think it's important to really understand the long term of that, and the post-Olympics part of that planning. Just to tag on to what you were saying, is that post-Olympics is just as important to be proactive in planning, to start knowing if you have an athlete that medals, where do you want them and how do you want to activate them, because they have other athletes, sponsors that are wanting that same time from them. So I think that's the benefit of being in advanced planning now, to understand that. But then going back to just benchmarks, I think the one thing that we have to remember is that while the Olympics feel far away, every 4 years feels like a long time, hopefully the surfing is here to stay. So really using 2020 as an opportunity to test and learn, and really not be afraid to have something that doesn't necessarily succeed under your normal expectations. I mean, I think that the window of Olympics sort of takes time, I think, to build some of that consistency with the sport being there. So not being afraid to try things, let them fail, and having different expectations. It's maybe not going to be the normal things that you would measure a campaign against, but really being willing to sort of look at that window for 2020 as, hey, we're just going to sort of try this, try that, and really analyze what we think works for what we want to get out of our athletes during that time. I think is really important.
I know you were touching on it a little earlier, Alana, but in terms of working with the sponsors, we were talking before we came up on stage as well about the Toyota campaign, and is that something that you were working with them and you were kind of creatively, or is it something that they brought to you and said, okay, we want to do these type of things?
The Toyota movement that they're kind of focusing on right now is their mobility. They're the mobility sponsor of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So if you guys noticed during the Pyeongchang Games, if you watched any of those commercials, and there was one called Against the Odds, where it was this amazing commercial about this woman that had no legs and she was also missing an arm, and the odds of her actually becoming a gold medalist. And the way that they played that out, it really hit home on just like a wow level, but also, there wasn't a car in that commercial, and that was really what Toyota was trying to get across. We're not about selling vehicles. We're about creating opportunities for humans to live their best lives, and that means giving them mobility through technology. So they're working on all these amazing like robotics and things like that for like bionic legs and awesome stuff. It's really amazing. But the angle that they took, it's been a long time coming, and they've really zeroed in on that mobility and movement company message. And so I'm thankful that I got on board with the company at a time when I've had a really, very fortunate career. I started working with Visa and Nike and AT&T and the Hilton, all the big, Olympic sponsors after I started ski racing, but I've never seen a sponsor be as inclusive as Toyota that's actually been thinking outside of this whole, like, we're trying to sell our product thing. And I think that's the reason Toyota is so successful, because it's hitting on a human level. It's not about surfers or skiers or, it's about this beautiful life that we're living and how we can celebrate it in the best way possible. And that's a human message. And that's why I think it's really been so successful.
Well, you bring up companies like Visa and these non-endemic, I should say non-endemic to surfing. It brings up the question then how you can leverage, with working with athletes that might have a non-endemic sponsor that's outside of surfing. How do you leverage that partnership and working with the media and the marketing aspect of it? Maybe Leanne, if you want to.
Yeah, I think, so I also just want to add to the piece I just said about benchmarks and really trying to understand how you're going to measure success in that. I will tell you that working on the campaign marketing of what you just spoke to, we are sort of used 2020. We're still all trying to figure out, like, how do we now prove to our client who has this big lofty idea, how do we actually show them traction, and how do we benchmark that? How do we create, promises of metrics that's going to help prove that sort of that traction is there for that campaign? I think that's why I say, don't be afraid to kind of try some things and figure out what does that look like. Are you trying to sell a product, or are you trying to sell a lifestyle? And I think that when you're with that, the lifestyle piece opportunity that the Olympics affords us, make sure you don't get so blindsided by trying to make that logo appearances and apparel sales that you miss that bigger piece. But I think that's hard to measure, and really working collaboratively with your team to kind of say, let's just figure out where we see upticks, where we see increase, and figure out what those metrics are. I think it's new charted territory, so don't be afraid to sort of just try things. So.
That's a tough thing though to rewire, because I think we come from a culture that's all about the sticker stoke, the placement. Is the logo visible? Are they on next year's gear? So I feel like they have to kind of rewire. This, I guess, gets back to expectations.
So I think I think one of being, working with a brand that isn't a non-endemic, we actually want our athletes that we work with to have all the value of their other sponsors. And we think that brings us credibility working in that space. I think that it also makes things more shareable, but I will tell you that it's going to be very interesting, because there's a handful of brands that you're probably experienced with that will do commercials and they'll break everything out. There's a lot of that goes back into Rule 40, and there's a chance that you're going to have an athlete that's not going to actually be able to wear anything that you want them to. It's that balance of like inauthenticity in those commercials, right? So I think trying to make partnerships with some of those sponsored non-endemics that kind of help hopefully bring some of your visibility through, I think is really important and is an opportunity. And I think that also being willing to say, hey, look, I understand that my logo is not in that commercial, but that commercial is airing prime time globally in the Olympics, and that is going to get visibility for my athlete. That's not about our brand, but that when people go searching for that athlete, they're going to see that we have this historical lifestyle with them, and it's going to bring them in and see the bigger picture in that new fan follower, like I mentioned before.
Yeah, so to that point, it's definitely like a rising tide floats all boats sort of mentality.
Absolutely.
Through a social metric or social media metric, which is one way to measure it, but like we have Ben Ferguson, who's pretty low pro, like in terms of, I don't know, his mainstream, awareness.
Yeah.
But you see like, metrics like, his followers are increasing by, 100%. And so it's one sort of viewpoint to see how it does, like that awareness like sort of broadens to this moment. And then again, if you're a brand or you have a relationship with an athlete, that's a beneficial, maybe not directly in the games, but like down the road and beyond, So that's.
Yeah, it's finding that balance. You don't want to come off as a shill. I think we see so much more content that's literally like a film. If you follow Yeti's model, and there's a lot of companies that are just trying to get back to the story and find something that's entertaining. And someone doesn't realize they just dedicated 8 minutes to watch your commercial, as subtle as it may be. But you bring up trying to quantify, and this gets back to the logo. But I want to talk about the difference between uniform and technical competition wear. And I'm sure this is going to be on the minds of a lot of the people from different companies here, because it's obvious that, it would be obvious, but I think we can assume that a lot of the companies in the room right now don't have the big accounts. Are going to go in with the over-encompassing sponsorship, so they're going to try to compensate with some type of visibility.
So the way that works, and that's at its core, they're going to be wearing your product when they're in the water with hundreds of millions of eyeballs on them, and that goes back to the central question that'll be determined by the ISA in conjunction with the IOC, and that's the distinction as to whether or not whether board shorts or wetsuits are a uniform or are they technical apparel. And once the IF makes that distinction, it then frees up the national governing body in each country to sell that category accordingly. So to put it into surf term, like the reality is, if the IF says it's uniform, the athlete will be forced to wear whatever brand the NGB does a deal with. So I work with Kaloe Andino. If Hurley isn't the sponsor of USA Surfing, he's going to need to wear whatever is the sponsor, whether it's Quick or whomever.
Yeah.
So that's a really important decision that's going to come down the pipeline, because if it's considered technical apparel, which is the case in swimming, for instance, the athlete is allowed to wear, in this case, their board shorts. Missy Franklin wears her Speedo swimsuit. However, in snowboarding, the determination was made that outerwear is not technical apparel, it's uniform. So therefore, no matter who you're sponsored by, you have to wear Burton, who was the sponsor of the governing body.
Which is odd, because it's some of the most technical wearables. It doesn't make absolutely no sense.
It speaks to how arbitrary the decision is. And it'll, and each governing body can make the choice too. They can decide whether, and even if it's categorized as uniform, they could decide to allow their athletes to wear what they want to wear.
So it behooves the industry, to push for that decision to be deemed technical.
It does.
Yeah.
I think, as an industry, it would do well to then figure out a way to support, in this case, USA Surfing.
Unless Chloe wants to wear Speedo.
Right. No, Speedo's highly unlikely to find that category with USA Surfing, but yeah.
Right.
No, and the reality is, though, those NGBs need money. And that's the primary way that they generate their revenue, is to sell the in-water piece of apparel. So that'll be, and I think that decision is going to be made in July for surfing. So that'll be a moment in time. And then just to make things more fun, there's also the USOC sells the sponsorship for opening and closing ceremonies, which is Ralph Lauren. And then they also sell through the medal ceremony, which is Nike. So no matter who sponsors anything, the athletes have to be in Ralph Lauren at open and close, and they have to be in Nike if they're up on the awards podium. So it's really, they slice and dice it quite a bit.
Do you guys have any suggestions, just from your perspective? Because I think it's always interesting to get an outside voice on what you think the surf companies and people within the surf industry could do to better handle the road as we approach Tokyo? I know it's a loaded question and it's pretty broad, but.
Again, Leanne, you were talking about this, but it's having that connection again, like all of you companies, and you have these relationships with these athletes, like that holds true all the way through, versus a Procter & Gamble that does a 6-month deal for the benefit of the games. Like sort of have faith in that, right? I think that is one sort of principle I would take into account. And maybe more technically, like, what is the distinction on boards, or what is the distinction on technical wear, that there could be some possibilities that they can get in there.
Yeah.
We've never grilled stuff, but
no, but so basically, if you're a manufacturer of the actual equipment, like there's no world where they're going to make them use a surfboard that is other than the surfboard that they want to compete on. But within that context, there are rules about how big the logos are. So you're not going to be able to, plaster the mayhem, across the entire surfboard. There will be a logo size requirement, and that's the case with, Lindsey Vonn has to get different goggles made by Oakley because the O on her goggles when she competes during the World Cup all season long is too big. So she has this little O that hits the exact specs.
You bring up a good point though. Oakley was definitely ahead of the curve, all these other companies, when snowboarding came in, and they had the right logo size, and they were able to capitalize on that versus other companies that just had to be taped out.
Yeah, no, and that's a great example. Imagine that. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Where brands literally had to put tape over their logos before their best exposure moment in time. And and I think as a big picture to realize that as brands that associate with these athletes, you're about to, the benefit of an entity spending tens of millions of dollars to make hundreds of millions of people aware of your athlete is a very unique moment in time. So to ignore that, it's at your fault, right? I mean, to pay attention to it and know the rules so that you can have board shorts that have the right size logo, that's just doing your homework and getting ready.
Oh, it's a challenge.
But it's hard, and it's complicated.
Well, I think that goes back to the timing thing. It's really understanding that there is a longer window here that you really need to be prepared for, of that pre-Olympic, to be able to make sure that you're following the rules. I think also having someone that you really allow to immerse themselves in all of those nuances, or bring someone from the outside in to help consult and kind of help guide you from a following the rules perspective. So I think you mentioned something earlier that you've definitely done these things as a non-sponsor, but you follow the rules. I think that understanding that the IOC and the USOC, they will pull things, they will send you letters, and they will definitely hurt any chances of even being part of conversations if you are not following those rules. And I think having someone that understands the rules and really having a timeline that makes sure you can capitalize off those rules is really important. And I think also that post-Olympics, again, making sure that you have, how you want to activate post-Olympics for someone that wins is really important, because we were talking earlier about maybe share about when you do win and that moment of being pulled in multiple directions and wanting to serve all your masters, but how do you prioritize someone, all your sponsors in the moment?
Yeah, and just from an athlete's perspective, we still have to train, right? So going up into the games, the content capture, I always really appreciated when companies that I were working with were, thinking very far ahead so we could knock that out. And, if there's anything else that needed to be done, like a day content capture here or there, it wasn't happening right before the games, because as you know, it's a huge event for the athlete to the anxiety and the anticipation of actually going and competing on top of all of your, prior responsibilities, and then you get there and you just want to be focused on what you have to do. And then having a game plan for after, and the Olympics are insane, and they're so tiring. You're there, the travel, the food, all of the different aspects of the emotional kind of roller coaster you're on at the games is one thing, but then the roller coaster even gets scarier after the games with all of the media and the tours that you do. And so as companies, I think it would really behoove you all to think, forward about what it is that you want to, you know, grab and really communicate with your athlete. And like we were talking earlier, just having those one-on-one real relationships is huge, you know, that are already established. But, you know, being able to communicate that and just so everybody's kind of has a good experience, you know.
Yeah, due diligence, cross the T's, dot the I's, and I think you brought up one of the best points is to establish the relationships early. And that, I mean, that's kind of what this industry is based on, is those strong relationships, but it's reaching out to entities that you're really not used to dealing with.
Again, I assume that most of you, the athletes you have, the relationships you have are built in that spirit, right? And I think that the non-endemics will this whole room comes with such credibility, right, in the sport of surfing, like to be the authoritative voice on it and what that means. So the Visas of the world, the Procter & Gambles of the world, like you could actually leverage their sort of firepower more so than they're going to lean on you to help tell the story of surfing, right? And that's, I think, you know, the sport could use that to its advantage. So.
I wanted, before we run out of time, can we open it up for Q&A? Does anyone have a question? So we got a mic running around there. Just raise your hand. We'll toss the mic. Okay.
Hey guys, girls. I was surfing in that heat.
You were, yeah.
Alana this morning, I had a winning wave, but Pat dropped in on me.
That's I went left. I'm gonna go back to the tape. Okay.
A lot of the brands in the industry are small. We have very big brands. We have a lot of really small brands. The top athletes have anywhere from 3 to 10 sponsors. Their logos are all over their boards, and some of them are as small as, you know, a wax or a leash company. How does it work for the athlete or for the collective group of brands on Rule 40? Mark, maybe you can answer this in terms of, can some of the brands collaborate in filing an application for Rule 40? Do all the smaller brands essentially get left out of the deal, you know, because they just don't have the firepower to put together a program?
No, I think if what you mean is, you know, does the branding, once, you know, the branding on an athlete's board, in the typical athlete endorsement agreement, you can't airbrush off logos, right? Now, it's different when you align with an Olympic sponsor, because anytime an Olympic sponsor does advertising that uses the rings, there cannot be any commercial logos except for that sponsor. So it'll be whitewashed. Okay, so set that aside for a moment though. So what you're talking about, I think it's a two-part question. One, no, you can't file jointly. So if you as a small brand want to run your own advertising campaign, you need to file for the exemption. But there's no size requirement. Any brand can file, and it's free.
And it can be a social media campaign.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It can be
Yeah.
social, it can be advertising, it can be product in store. So if it's your custom leash, and I won't go too deep into it, but theoretically, product that has the athlete's name on it has to be filed for. But what in your case too, though, is if Red Bull gets their exemption and they're running creative with Lindsay, like all of her branding, or with Kalohe Andino, every sponsor on his board will be present on the Red Bull creative, because that's the way that relationship works. And once you file for the exemption, you don't have to airbrush anything off. So when you work together to create content that's going to be utilized, like that's the best backdoor in, is to create content that NBC wants to use, or create, you know, just this crazy story like we did with Project X with Shaun White, which to the point of authenticity and longevity of a relationship, I think it bears the 30-second summary of what Red Bull did with Shaun when we came up with this concept to truly tell the story of how you helped that athlete evolve and fulfill their dreams. And the reality is that Red Bull built a private halfpipe for Shaun to learn the double cork. And we filmed a television show, 60 Minutes came in. I mean, it was a home run. It was absolutely, Red Bull helped him win that gold medal. I can attest to that. And it was a fantastic story, and it aired across, you know, it was on NBC, and that content's been used, and that's one of
And it had a life well beyond the Olympics.
well beyond.
Yeah.
which
But
is
it was a, thanks, Mike. But it was a gamble. I mean, in the sense that it was a big investment, it wasn't a guaranteed thing. The Olympics are funky because you never know the day of. I mean, speaking from an athlete, like shit goes wrong, right?
Yeah.
But Sean was a pretty good bet. So
That was a good one. That one worked.
Another question for our esteemed panel.
I have one other one.
Okay.
Um,
We're going to cut you off after 2.
That's okay. I appreciate that. Do you have a disaster story of a brand that thought they had all the application ready to go, they had planned everything well in advance, they got rejected, they had already spent a lot of money on the deal and it didn't come through?
I've had aspects of the application get turned back and then help the brands to reconfigure and reapply. I haven't had like a full-blown disaster. I think the closest we came was another Sean story with Target. We did an activation where we, with Target, did the 9 face in Times Square. It's a massive billboard. And it was this Sean Winter Wonderland. And it went up 2 weeks before the blackout period started. And we had talked it through with Target where we knew the USOC was going to be like, hey, what the hell with these walls? They're coming down, right? And so what we did is we had creative all ready to send to the USOC right when they called me. We fired it over. And what we had done is the night before the blackout, sent up the painters and they painted over Sean's image in all of it and wrote "Gone to Vancouver." So it was a clever, like it really got close. And we had a $100,000 budget to paint the walls and make them clean if the USOC was gonna say no. But it was gonna have to be a game day decision based on whether or not they were gonna be okay with this kind of, this workaround where we painted over him and wrote "Gone to Vancouver." And I think that they were a little bit more flexible on that because they didn't have a sponsor in the retail category. Like I think if Red Bull had tried to do that, they would have shut it down. So again, to the sort of the somewhat arbitrary nature of the application of these rules.
That was sneaky.
It was sneaky.
Yeah. One in the back?
Hey guys and girls, I was just wondering if there's been a clear protocol set for how they'll choose the Surfing USA Olympic team as like ISA championing the Olympics for surf, but then WSL holding the best surfers in the world.
They have. Do you guys? Yeah.
I think it sounds like you're on the Coconut Wireless. So
there's an answer. The ISA has aligned with the WSL, and the WSL rankings are going to be the first tier of qualification for the Olympics. So if you're in the top 10 and you're one of the top 2 from your country, you're in through the WSL rankings. And you can look up, if you just Google ISA, WSL.
And it's 2 men, 2 women from each country, correct? Or
Yes, max.
2 men, 2 women from each country.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Julie, maybe it'd be prudent for you to go over the rim in regards to logos. I know Bob kind of touched on it, but if you look at apples to apples with snowboarding, manufacturer logos can only be on the board or the helmet if it's like an inline product, right? Like a Giro logo can be if it's sold as a Giro, or a Rossignol snowboard can have a Rossignol logo, but no other logos on the board. So maybe if you could touch on that.
Yeah, that's correct. The only logo that can appear on any piece of equipment is the OEM. And by the way, because I'm sure there's some clever folks out here thinking, oh, okay, well, we'll just make a couple of surfboards and sell them. It has to be a legitimately offered product to the general public.
There's a certain number of SKUs that you produce. I think I have to look at the number, but I think you have to be produce and sell like over 1,000, 5,000 of that product to consider it.
Yeah,
an OEM product.
They've definitely created a.
But you can look into that. There's definitely rules, but you can do a one-off product, put it in stores, and as long as you have the volume, it can count.
It'd be tricky. Like if you're not a true OEM of a product category, they'll sniff that out pretty quickly.
Yes? Way in the back? Greg?
What's the remedy for a Rule 40 violation if they actually enforced it?
They can take away the athlete's credential.
Or medal.
Yeah. Or medal. Yeah, it's a post.
They've done that once, I think in the 70s.
Yeah, you definitely, they're very careful to try not to do that, but that is the ultimate remedy.
And I think the smaller brands may say, well, I have a small brand, I may not be able to, they don't have the visibility, they will see it, they'll catch it, they'll definitely send you the letter. And I think that brand size is irrelevant when it comes to those rules, absolutely, they'll see it.
And it creates a distraction for the athlete. Like if they're having to get inquiries from governing bodies about ad campaigns, to Alana's point, it's a hell of a lot of pressure on these guys to perform in front of a lot of eyeballs, and they only get to do it once every 4 years. So if you as a brand create a distraction for the athlete, I think that that's a miss.
Okay, all right. You guys, how about a round of applause? Great information. Bravo to us. Bravo to us.